Good afternoon. This is Good Medicine. Today we're going to talk about Japan. We are going to talk about our history with Japan and what that looks like. And we are going to talk a little bit about World War II and our relationship with Japan before World War II. So, it's really important to realize that we need to understand people's cultural perspectives on things. And I discussed this a little bit in talking about the potential start of a civil war in America and how important it is that we understand the Southern perspective on the Civil War, besides labeling them all as bigoted, slave-holding racists. Because to the South, it was about a lot more than that. And we can condemn their actions, but we can also embrace some of what they're trying to say. And we can do the same with foreign countries and wars that we conduct with foreign countries. And we're going to attempt to do that with Japan today. So, I often tell my students, it's no mistake that two of the greatest imperial powers and colonial powers to ever exist were Japan and Great Britain. What do they have in common? Well, they live on rocks that are islands and that have finite resources available to them. And they can't push their borders past whatever their island is. And in the case of Japan, this happens at the Takanawa Shogunate. I probably said that wrong, but take it at face value. So, it took years and years and years of tribal fighting and tribal warfare to unite Japan under one system of government. This took a very long time. So, Japan and China and a lot of these Asian countries were very wary of the effect that an influx of someone else's culture could have on the institutions that they had set up in their own countries. And they understood the importance of culture, and they still do. And this is why if you're in North Korea and you get caught with a USB with American movies, you can get in a lot of trouble. And this is why if you're in China and you get caught in some way, shape, or form, I don't know if it's selling U.S. or Western media or whatever, but there are certain laws that are put in place against consuming Western entertainment. And I often talk about how pissed China was when Kung Fu Panda was made, and they said, why are the United States making a movie, a cultural movie about China that's better than the Chinese cultural movie about China? Makes mad, and they don't like that, and they really get the importance of culture. So, say that to say this. When the shogunate was set up in Japan, they would not allow foreign influence, because it takes one person to show up with the Bible to throw off everything you've spent the last 100 years building. Right? It can throw your entire society into chaos overnight. And that, sweet, sweet feudal system money that you're making, well, there goes that. So, Japan is living a very isolationist lifestyle. And Japan is not very interested in doing business with the West, and that is until Admiral Perry. Remember, Admiral Perry shows up to Japan, and it makes sense, right? We're trying to expand our influence. We're trying to make new trade partners. And it's only sensical that we go to Japan, because if you leave California and you go straight, you're going to hit Japan. So, perfect, pretty big population. Seemingly good ally to make to start having influence in the Asia Pacific. And they weren't wrong. So, initially, Japan says, no, guys, I'm good. Thanks, but no thanks. It's a hard pass. And, Admiral Perry and the United States don't accept this. They don't accept the sovereignty of Japan, because what they do is they come back again, and this time they have their navy painted white. And they show up at Japan's borders, and they say, how about now? Oh, those are my big guns over there. Take a look out the window. Look at the horizon. Look out into the water. All those white things you see, that's what's called a navy. I know you don't have one, but I do. There's guns on all those things, and they'll blow you up. So let's be friends. Japan says, okay, now, I would do a disservice to the genius of Dan Carlin by not referring you to Supernova in the East, his latest installment on Japan. But I will say this very briefly. Japan undergoes perhaps the most radical industrialization and technological advancement and economic advancement and societal shift that has ever been gone through in all of human history. They were living in a samurai culture, a feudal samurai culture, isolationist. And in 40 years, they are producing their own aircraft and tanks. It is... There's just nothing to compare it to. Because typically, it's like, imagine if, you know, we encounter some of the steppe tribes in the Americas, right? And let's say it's the 1800s. And then within 20 years, they're fighting wars with the same weaponry that we have in the United States, right? And we're going to fight Native Americans, and they're getting in formation, and they have cannons, and they have factories that are building the guns, and they have, you know, massive buildings that they're working on, and all sorts of technological advancements. That would just... It's such a foreign concept, right? Like, yeah, some of the Native American groups got their hands on guns, but they didn't own the means of production. The Japanese did. They molested us for our minds and took the mine for everything it was worth and picked it furiously for the benefit of Japan. They played the long game. And not other Asian countries weren't willfully participating in it the way Japan was. And it was to their great detriment by the time the 30s rolled around. So, again, Supernova in the East, it'll talk about a lot of things I'm going to talk about today, but way more in depth and really good. So, Japan undergoes this massive industrialization, and what do you need to industrialize? Well, you need oil, and a lot of it. And guess who's one of the #1 oil-producing nations in the world? And actually today is the #1 oil-producing nation in the world. You're living in it. Welcome to America. All right? We have a lot of natural resources. And we are able to leverage our natural resources to obviously meet our needs economically, but also to meet our political goals often and our diplomatic goals. And that's part of the deal, right? We want to have this diplomatic maneuver, and we're going to support this diplomatic maneuver by offering rights to this amount of our oil for this price, whatever. So eventually Japan starts getting very aggressive, right? And they're posturing in the Asia Pacific, and we have the taking over of the Korean Peninsula, and then they start to move into China. Remember, they lack the natural resources that they need to sustain the empire that they want. So, I often think about, and ironically enough, I believe it's the Japanese wasp compared to the honeybee. So, and it's almost like the comparison of sedentary versus nomad. You have the sedentary honeybee, and the sedentary honeybee produces a hive, and it owns the means of production, and it produces its own nectar and honey and whatever the hell bees do, right? The Japanese wasp does not produce squat. The Japanese wasp is a war machine. It's terrifying. And their entire existence revolves around their ability to steal the products and labor of other bees. That's it. They don't know how to produce a nest. They don't know how to produce honey. They don't produce the things that they need to sustain themselves. And in essence, this is kind of Japan. You know, I can lack all the resources I want if I have a big badass military, right? So, Japan goes, you have obviously the seizure of the Korean Peninsula, you have things like the rape of Nanking occur, and eventually the United States says, Japan, we aren't okay with what you're doing. Because what we're hoping at the time is China's kind of going through their own thing, right? Which led to that thing that's happening right now, which is on the verge of superpowerdom, if not there already. And you have this leader, Chiang Kai-shek, I believe his name is, and he's a nationalist leader, and he's kind of willing to play ball with some Western nations for the right price, under the right situation, and he surely doesn't want to accept Japanese rule. Many of these people don't want to accept Japanese rule, and they want China, Western nations want China to eventually form a... Sorry, let me get past this guy. He's driving like an asshole. They want China to eventually be a democracy. That's the goal, because, you know, democracy theory. They sure as hell don't want them to fall to a fascistic form of leadership like a lot of Europe is at the time. And, you know, down the line, communism is going to start becoming a real concern for obvious reasons, right? So, we say, Japan, you need to stop doing what you're doing in China. You need to leave them alone. And if you don't stop doing what you're going to do in China, well, we're going to cut off your oil supply. And you go, oh, that sucks. Like, I guess I'll have to go elsewhere. Like, no, that's not it. You're done. Your empire is done. It's finished. You have no more oil. 80% of Japan's oil was coming from the United States of America. They did not yet have the means to produce their oil that they needed. Eventually, part of their plan for World War II was to indeed find alternative sources for their oil and the ability to ship oil to Japan without U.S. interference, which was made difficult by U.S. acquisitions in the Spanish-American War, mainly the Philippines and Guam. So, Japan is starting to finagle this idea, like, do we give up empire? We're on the verge of the greatest empire that has been seen in the Asian theater in quite a long time, and we are Japanese. You have to remember, the Japanese in many respects are the Asian version of the Nazis. Very fascistic in many ways, very supremacist in many ways. They looked at other ethnic Asians as being inferior, very similarly to the way the Germans would have viewed the Slavs, the Japanese would have viewed the Koreans. They really felt that they were meant to rule over a massive empire, and I don't necessarily know what their long game was, but I know at the very least they wanted the Asian sphere of influence, which I'm pretty sure is what Xi Jinping is after and will probably get. So, they're mulling this idea over. What do we do? Do we give up our empire? Do we give up our future prosperity? Do we just be Japanese, right? We're moving toward this manufacturing thing. If we're still getting U.S. oil, then we can produce a lot of the stuff we need on the mainland. No. Let's risk it for the biscuit. So, essentially what the Japanese thought is that they could deliver the United States a decisive blow. And what they really needed was enough time to establish the routes that they were going to need by which they would receive the 80% of fuel that they had to make up from the lack of 80% of fuel they had been getting from the United States. And again, part of that plan was getting control over the Philippines and getting control over Guam. That was essential to their plan. And what they really wanted was kind of like 6 months, like knockout punch. And then they could have their oil networks established, and they didn't feel they were going to have to worry too much about the long game. So, as they're planning this attack on Pearl Harbor, which is actually, you know, it's meant to take out aircraft carriers, because Hitaki Tojo and many of the Japanese admirals and higher classes, they knew that was going to be the future of warfare. Many people wanted to go mainly for capital ships and for advanced battleships. They knew the aircraft carriers were going to be a problem, and they wanted to take them out. And, well, by happenstance, our aircraft carriers were in port. So that was good for us. But as this is being planned, and they're saying, okay, what are we going to do with Pearl Harbor? What are we going to hit? What are our targets going to be? Let's get some pictures, blah, blah, blah. They know all this is going on, but they're still continuing diplomacy with the United States under the guise that they're still friends and that Japan's just kind of getting their ducks in a row and working out how they're going to, proceed, right? And, gosh, I want to say the ambassador to Japan's name was Hinoma, something to that effect. I don't have notes with me on this one, so this is top of the dome piece. We're going to go with Hinoma. That's going to be his new alias if I'm wrong. Hinoma. So this gentleman, Hinoma, who is the ambassador to the United States of America. It's Hinoma or Kazimoto? Kazimoto sounds way cooler. Let's go with Kazimoto. So, this gentleman by the name of Kazimoto, who was Japan's ambassador to the United States, knew that Japan was plotting this surprise attack. They were mulling over a few options, but it was pretty decidedly certain it was going to be Pearl Harbor. And his chief objective was to buy time. And part of him buying time was taking a trip to the United States. So, at that point in time, if you want to take a trip to the United States from Japan, you take a boat, go to California, and then you go from California all the way to New York, or at very least Washington. And he gets on this train, and he goes from California, and a day goes by, and he's probably thinking like, oh, cool, we're there. And then, no, you're not there yet, right? And then another day goes by. Oh, okay, we got to be there now. No. 4 or 5 days it takes. And the entire way, this guy's looking out the window, and he's seeing billowing smoke come up from factories, and he's seeing agriculture, and he's seeing cattle, and he's seeing, middle America, and cities, and oil pumps, and all these things. And by the time he arrives at his destination where his meeting is going to occur, he literally says, we shouldn't do this. This is a bad idea. This is a massive country, and we are underestimating their industrial capacity. But Japan is very convinced in the territories it sees, its holdings in Korea and its holdings in China. And Japan's kind of comparing its ability to produce on par with the United States on its recent acquisitions of territory that it's stolen. So, Kazimoto sees that this is probably a bad plan. It's not good. So, we have the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japan's plan to get their very important trade network and alternative oil supply worked out, or it didn't work out the way they intended, and it was just absolutely detrimental to them. Screwed them, big time. The war proceeds, and we get to 1945, and this is kind of what I wanted to talk about a little today. I think about Harry Truman, and I think about, for one, he's coming in for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is just a wildly popular president, for the most part. Today, he's obviously divisive, and he kind of splits the thinking and logic of conservative versus Democrat, and whatever. In his time, he is popular. He has the trust of his people. He wasn't elected to 4 terms for no reason. So Truman's coming in for this godlike president, FDR. And he has to wrap this war up in the way that he sees best fit. And this thing called the Manhattan Project is coming to fruition. And they test these bombs, and he now has this weapon that, there was fire bombings in Tokyo people don't really talk about. We had ways of essentially getting these massive balls of fire rolling through the streets of like different Japanese cities. So there was all sorts of like chaos weaponry, but the nuke was just something different. And I think about the decision that he had to make. And I often hear people argue that like it was terrible and it's the worst thing in the world, and I have to be honest with you. I think I would have made the same decision. I think that Truman saved millions of lives, not just American. And I think it's easy for me to say because my kids didn't get burnt up in Nagasaki, and, my family didn't get burnt up in Hiroshima. And, it must be awful. And I would never want to have to make that decision. But at the end of the day, Japan was not in any way, shape, or form ready to surrender. And it would have very likely cost us millions of lives to wrap that war up. So the main medicine that I had for you today is to really understand the importance of culture, for one, as Japan understood it. To understand the importance of industry. And I've tried to talk about this in technology, and I try to talk about this with the South and the North, right? You have these hard Southern men, and they grow up in military academies and military settings, and they're far more likely to have that experience that you want from a soldier at war. But the North has the industry and the railroads, and that typically wins large-scale symmetrical wars. It's very important when we're talking like fight versus fight with multiple theaters, not like a seriously offensive, defensive action. So bear that in mind. Bear in mind Quasimodo as he goes through the United States of America and sees just these massive buildings and industry and agriculture, and him having the foresight to know, don't poke the sleeping bear. Let the sleeping bear lie. This is a bad idea. Something I really love about Japan and the advancements that they went through in just such a remarkable period of time is Japan had the Torah and many of the Jewish holy texts translated to Japanese because Japan recognized the success that Jewish people were experiencing where they went in the world, and instead of assigning them malice or assigning them some type of nefarious objective, they said, hey, I want to be like you guys because you guys are doing something right, so why don't I start with your holy books? I just think that's such a Japanese thing to do. How interesting. Instead of hating them and wanting to genocide them and kicking them out of your country, not that Japan was opening its borders up for all the Jews, but it is interesting that was their approach. It was a uniquely Japanese thing to do. So try to learn from people when you can. It's your medicine for the day.